Although dramatic stories of window-smashing suffragettes have passed into history, it's the haunting picture of the forcibly fed suffragette that some consider the definitive image of the suffragette campaign. Well, hello there. I'm Christina, and you're listening to History and Hearsay. In today's episode, I wanted to share with you guys all about this beautiful jewelry I'm wearing. Ana Luisa is a jewelry company based in New York City. They strive to offer simple, beautiful, and high-quality jewelry at a fair price. Now, they also specialize in dainty jewelry, which is typically my go-to style of jewelry, which is another reason that I'm really drawn to their pieces. I'm also a sucker for really fun, cute packaging, and I think their packaging is really cute and super unique, especially for jewelry. I picked 3 pieces that are really dainty just because that is my style. I love how classy these pieces look. So the ring I chose is called the Stephanie, and I got it 2 sizes larger than what I normally wear. I normally am a 7 and I got it in a 9 because I wanted to wear it on my middle finger, and as you guys can see, it fits perfectly. It kind of makes me want to go back and get a few others for like stacking. I just think they're so feminine and something about a thin gold band that I'm just loving right now. And I've also really been all about the gold for the last 10 years or so. I'm really loving the yellow gold jewelry. And so as you guys can see in these clips, these 3 pieces that I'm wearing today are all gold, and I just think they are so beautiful. And with more than 25,000 5-star reviews, Ana Luisa is so confident that you'll love the quality of their pieces that they come with a 2-year, no questions asked warranty, and they also offer free exchanges and also free shipping for customers in the US. Now, they're currently running several different sales across the website, so when you're finished watching today's episode, make sure you go and check out my link down below in the description box and get you some beautiful, timeless pieces at an affordable price. And in case anyone is interested in buying the exact pieces that I'm wearing in today's video, I did tell you guys the ring is called the Stephanie, but the layered necklace is called the Willow, and then the dainty ring that I'm wearing is called the Elise. And thank you to Ana Luisa for sending me these beautiful pieces. The women's suffrage movement in the UK began in the mid-1800s as organized campaigns began to take place across the UK after Mary Smith delivered the first women's suffrage petition to Parliament in 1866. A women's suffrage committee was formed in London, which soon sparked other groups being set up in other areas, such as the Manchester's National Society for Women's Suffrage. Millicent Garrett Fawcett led the National Union for Women's Suffrage Society, the NUWSS, which was set up in 1897. These women were known as suffragists as they believed in enfranchising women by peaceful means such as protests and petitions. This group stayed away from violence, but Emmeline Pankhurst, who was then a member of the NUWSS, decided to employ more direct and militant tactics, leading her to set up the Women's Social and Political Union, or the WSPU, with her 2 daughters, Sylvia and Christabel. The WSPU was established in either 1903 or 1906. I'm not sure where that discrepancy comes from, but I saw both of those dates. Regardless, this union's main objective at the time was to campaign for the parliamentary vote for women in Britain. Another group, the Women's Freedom League, or the WFL, was set up a year later by Charlotte Despard and Teresa Billington Gregg. And this group was different from the other 2 groups in regards to their approach. So they weren't really as violent or militant as one of the group, but they also weren't as passive as the other. They were kind of a middle-of-the-road group, if you will. Emmeline Pankhurst's group, the WSPU's motto was deeds, not words, and many of their actions were considered extreme by the population. They included large rallies and hunger strikes. This caused them to be considered the most notorious of the women's suffrage groups, with some 1,000 of their members being imprisoned between 1905 and the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. In addition to the right to vote, this group also pushed for wider social reforms in education and employment. Prior to the general election of 1906, the Liberal Party was expected to win, and the suffragettes engaged in nonviolent actions to press their cause. This included questioning the leading members of the Liberal Party and deputations to Parliament. So the Liberal Party's candidate was Herbert Asquith, who was a renowned opponent of women's suffrage. He did in fact win the election and became the prime minister in 1908. And this was said to have made the fight for the suffragettes even harder. In 1912, they were banned from the Liberal Party meetings and started to engage in secret attacks on public and private property. They would vandalize letterboxes, fire empty buildings, and smash shop windows in London's West End. These were all considered tactics to try and force the government to yield to their demands. This group did maintain that their aim was never to endanger any human life. On October 17, 1912, Emmeline Pankhurst said that the only recklessness the militant suffragettes have shown about human life has been their own lives. Now, the hunger strike as a political tool was introduced not by the WSPU leadership, but by a member, a sculptor and illustrator by the name of Marion Wallace Dunlop. On July 5th, 1909, Marion was sent to Holloway Prison for printing an extract of the Bill of Rights on a wall at St. Stephen's Hall in the House of Commons. And once in prison, Marion went on this hunger strike. She was protesting against the refusal of the authorities to recognize her as a political offender because, as such, she would have been entitled to be placed in the first division where political prisoners enjoyed more privileges there. And so after 91 hours of fasting, she was released from prison. So seeing this example and believing that she was onto something, other imprisoned suffragettes began hunger striking as well. And the government responded by forcibly feeding them, arguing that this ordinary hospital treatment was necessary to preserve the women's lives. And so began a vicious cycle of events that was to shape the representation of the suffragette movement for years to come. Now, personally, I never really understood the whole hunger strike thing. I always felt like, oh, whoa, you're not going to eat. Well, hurt your own self then. Cool. But I guess when you're in a place of authority like the government or prison officials, you kind of have an obligation to take care of your prisoners or at least keep them safe. So I guess they didn't want to have to explain why someone in their care was harmed. And there is also something to be said for martyrs raising more support for their cause. So the government officials had that to consider as well. And it does seem like these hunger strikes were pretty good at getting people's attention. The image of the individual suffragette voluntarily on hunger strike in her isolated prison cell, it had a pretty powerful effect. So they start forcibly feeding these women, and if you're watching this episode on YouTube, I'm sharing with you guys some pretty powerful photos of this process. I can only imagine the emotions that this would stir up in people seeing these photographs at that time, especially if you shared their beliefs. Now, the way these women were forcibly fed was said to have been a brutal, life-threatening, and degrading procedure. They were forcing rubber tubes down their throats, which were said to not always be new. Like, some of them had previously been used. So that's pretty gross. So just to give a little more context of how these forcible feedings happened, they would have a female warder come into the prisoner's room, and they would either hold them down on the bed or they would tie them to a chair, and then two male doctors would perform the forced feeding by pouring a mixture of milk, bread, and brandy down the rubber tube that was either forced up a nostril or pushed down the throat into the stomach. Now, down the throat into the stomach was said to have been the more painful method because a steel gag was inserted into the prisoner's mouth and screwed open as wide as it could possibly go. And so tissues in the mouth, nose, and throat were nearly always damaged during this process. And sometimes the tube was accidentally inserted into the windpipe, causing food to enter the lungs, endangering the prisoner's life. While prominent public figures such as George Bernard Shaw and the Labor MP Kerr Hardy spoke out against these practices, the Liberal government continued to justify their actions as ordinary hospital treatment for those prisoners who refused to eat. And this statement was supported by most newspaper editors during that time. Henry Nevilleson and Henry Brailsford, influential lead writers for the Daily News, resigned in protest against their editors' support for this policy. One of the earliest women to be forcibly fed was a working-class woman by the name of Mary Lee in September of 1909. They used a nasal feeding tube, and she later wrote about her experience in an influential pamphlet that was widely distributed among supporters of the movement. And in this pamphlet, she wrote that it was an outrage. She said that the sensation is most painful. The drums of the ears seem to be bursting, a horrible pain in the throat and the breast. She said that they pushed the tube down 20 inches. She resisted and was overcome by the weight of numbers. I guess that means like them holding her down, like the weight of their bodies holding her down. That's how I'm reading that. But when the leadership of the WSPU read this, they were so shocked and outraged that they commissioned a well-publicized poster titled "Torturing Women in Prison," which depicted how they were doing these forced feedings in gruesome detail. Another famous WSPU prisoner was Lady Constance Lytton. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Lytton. It was commonly believed that working-class prisoners were treated much worse than their well-known middle-class counterparts. And so when Lady Constance went on a hunger strike and was simply released after 2 days, she set out to prove that she had been given preferential treatment because of her family's background. So to prove her point, she assumed the disguise of Jane Wharton, a working woman, and she rejoined the WSPU under her new name. As Jane, Lady Constance was arrested outside of Liverpool and sent to the same prison. She did her same hunger strike routine, and this time they forcibly fed her 8 times. Lady Constance later wrote that the pain of the forced feeding was intense. She said the doctors turned the steel gag in her mouth much more than what was necessary until her jaws were fastened wide apart. Far more than they could naturally go. She said the doctor then put a tube down her throat, which seemed to be much too wide and was something like 4 feet in length. And she was choking from the moment it hit her throat until they got it all the way down. Then the food was poured down her throat so quickly, she said, "It made me sick a few seconds after it was down, and the action of the sickness made my body and legs double up. But the wardesses instantly pressed back my head and the doctors leant on my knee. The horror of it was more than I can describe." Once her true identity was known, Lady Constance was hastily released, further proving her point about the differential treatment for women from different social backgrounds. She was said to have never fully recovered from her ordeal. Yet for Lady Constance, as with others who had gone on hunger strikes and been forcibly fed, they were applauded by the WSPU leadership, who presented hunger strikers with commemorative medals, saying it was for their valor in pursuing to the last extremity of hunger and hardship a great principle of political justice. At the end of 1810, the WSPU suspended militant action for the year of 1911 in order to allow for various bills for women's suffrage to be presented in Parliament. But when no agreements had been reached by March of 1912, suffragettes felt that they had been betrayed by empty promises, and militant protests such as window smashing started up all over again. The vicious cycle of hunger striking and forced feedings returned. And in April 1913, after the passing of the Cat and Mouse Act, the ordeal of forcible feedings became especially cruel and dangerous. This act allowed for prisons to release prisoners who were on a hunger strike and basically let them back out into the community with the intent to rearrest them the second they had eaten something. And so even though this act prolonged the experience in theory, like if women were released after doing a hunger strike, they would eat, they would be rearrested and brought back into prison, the WSPU saw this as a great publicity gift that the government had given them, because a lot of these women, or mice in this scenario, were able to evade the police or the cat and, get away, not be immediately rearrested, and they would just appear at some type of meeting or demonstration. And so this was giving them a lot of publicity, and a widely circulated WSPU poster of a large ginger cat bearing his bloodied teeth on the limp, injured body of a small suffragette vividly portrayed the brutality of it all. Now, over time, imprisoned suffragettes began looking for a quicker way to be released. And so Emmeline's daughter, Sylvia, initiated a thirst and hunger strike as a more advanced version of this whole thing. And when they saw that it was working and they would be released sooner, other prisoners started to do the same thing. By the end of December 1913, Emmeline had added a sleep strike to the refusal to eat or drink. Authorities refused to force feed Emmeline because they feared that with her they might have a martyr on their hands, and so Emmeline, in a severely emaciated state, was released just 4 days later. For some reason, they weren't worried about this with her daughter Sylvia, and she was forcibly fed until her gums were bleeding and pieces of loose, jagged flesh were just like hanging out of her mouth. Sylvia and other women who had gone through similar treatments talked about how they would often cough the tube up 3 to 4 times before it was able to get fully down there and feed them. And Sylvia said it was complete agony. But the publicity they got from publishing their personal accounts in the suffragette press gathered more and more camaraderie among their ranks. And this sense of sisterhood is seemingly what kept these women going back again and again to get arrested, go on hunger strikes, and be forcibly fed. However, by 1914, the government's response to hunger strikes had only become more brutal, and more tales started coming out of accidents that were happening when they were trying to use these feeding tubes. Ethel Moorhead, an imprisoned in Edinburgh, I hope I said that right. Last time I did a video on Edinburgh, you guys let me know in the comments. I kept saying it wrong. I think I said it 4 different ways, and I think it was still wrong. But you guys know what I'm trying to say. So Ethel, she developed double pneumonia after 8 forced feedings when some foreign substance had entered her lungs. And another famous suffragette by the name of Kitty Marion was forcibly fed 232 times. And she said the pain she experienced was so bad that she thought she was going mad, and she begged the doctor to just give her some poison. At this point, more and more of the general public began to notice the brutality of it all. An increasing number of doctors, as well as members of the general public, were speaking out against forcible feeding, saying it went against the rules of medical practice, and that these doctors who were performing these operations were punishing rather than treating their patients. Even the Times, who was well known at that time for being anti-suffragism, were suggesting a review of this policy. 116 doctors sent a memorial of protest to the Prime Minister, but it's believed the reason that many other medical practitioners failed to condemn the practice and kind of just went along with it was due to their cozy relationship with the government and their anti-suffragism views. By mid-July 1914, a few women, such as Fanny Parker, started to write about how they were fed through other holes, like further down on the body, not the nose and mouth, the other two. Yeah. So they were putting the feeding tube somewhere else. And I'm not sure what the reasoning was behind that, but things were definitely progressing and getting worse. So it seems like they were stuck in this whole cat and mouse situation. Neither side was willing to give up. And so everything sounds like it was getting out of hand. Then in 1914, World War I breaks out, and this enabled both the WSPU and the authorities to kind of retreat from the whole situation. Emmeline Pankhurst called for a temporary suspicion of militancy, while the government granted amnesty to all the suffragette prisoners. Today, it is believed that the practice of hunger strikes that was common among suffragettes in prison did long-term damage to their physical and mental health. Many credit the onset of World War I as one of the major factors that changed the minds of those who were opposed to women having the same rights as men. The upheaval of war brought an abrupt end to many of the Edwardian era's most restrictive traditions and required many women to step into roles that had previously been held by men. Women started having to manage budgets, work in factories, work on the land, and these collapsing barriers brought down with them many of the arguments against women gaining the vote. Once there was a shortage of able-bodied men around, women had to fill those roles, and it kind of opened up people's eyes to the fact that women were capable. And one such prominent person who changed his mind about women's suffrage was the Prime Minister himself, Herbert Asquith, who declared his support of women's suffrage in 1916. In 1918, the Representation of the People's Act was passed. This allowed men over 21 and women over 30 to vote. Now, what's often overlooked about this bill and this whole movement in general is that while this was the first step in allowing women to vote, many men weren't allowed to vote during this time either because only property owners could vote. And so about 42 to 45% of men during that time couldn't vote because they didn't own property. It's widely believed that the growth of the Labor Party is a big part of how we got this first step towards all adults being able to have the right to vote. And many believe it was more about the fact that the government was worried about a revolution happening after World War I. And so all of this together contributed to the bill being passed. They were kind of just trying to pacify people at this time. Now, something I never knew that I came across when I was researching this is that prior to the 1918 Act being passed, men had to be residences for over 1 year in order to be able to vote. And so this is said to have stopped a large number of the troops who'd been serving overseas during the war from being able to vote. So they were going out of the country, and because they had been out of the country and they hadn't been there the last year, they weren't even allowed to vote. They were out putting their life on the line, and they couldn't vote because of it. So this act in 1918 took care of that by allowing men in the armed forces to be able to vote from the age of 19. And then finally, in 1923, the Equal Franchise Act was passed, which granted women over 21 the right to vote, finally giving them the same voting rights as men. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Don't forget to check out the link in my description box down below and get your own Anna Louise jewelry pieces, and I'll catch you all right here in the next one.